Wars don't just erupt overnight. They're born from these really deep currents of history and power and identity. And the war in Ukraine, it's not just about borders on a map. It's really a conflict over who gets to write the story of an entire region.
So that's the big question, right? You see the headlines, you hear the news, but how did we actually get here? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this explainer. We're going to try to unravel that incredibly complex history.
Okay, so at the very heart of this thing, you've got two completely different ways of seeing the world. It's like two clashing narratives. On one hand, you have Russia's view. They see it as defending a historical sphere of influence, protecting what they call a brother nation. But on the other hand, the West sees it as something totally different, protecting a sovereign country from just unprovoked aggression. And these two stories, these two lenses, are how every single event gets interpreted.
All right, to even begin to make sense of these two clashing views, we've got to go back. Way back. We're going to start at the very beginning, with a shared cradle of civilization that, eventually split onto two very, very different paths.
So check this out. It all starts with a shared origin story. Way back in the 9th century, you have Kievan Rus. This was literally the cradle for both Russians and Ukrainians. But then, bam, the Mongol invasion in the 13th century just shatters that unity. And in the centuries after that, Muscovy, which is basically the precursor to modern Russia, it starts to rise up in the northeast. At the same time, the lands that would become Ukraine, they start drifting west, aligning with places like Poland, Lithuania. And that, right there, was the Great Split. In this quote, this really gets to the emotional heart of Russia's entire narrative. You have to understand, for Moscow, Kiev isn't just some neighbor, some other capital city. No, it represents the very birthplace of their civilization, their religion, their culture. So this isn't just about geopolitics for them, it's deeply, deeply personal. So, imagine this. For centuries, the lands of what we now call Ukraine were basically carved up and passed between different empires. Poland, Lithuania, the Russian Empire, Austro-Hungary. And this constant division, this mosaic of control, it created this lasting tension inside Ukraine itself. It left a legacy, a kind of fault line, with an east that often looked toward Moscow and a west that was always looking toward Europe. And that fault line, it is absolutely still relevant today.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. We're jumping to the 20th century. This is where the collapse of huge empires is going to dramatically reshape the map and, really, set the stage for the conflict we see today.
1991, just that 1 year. It marks one of the biggest geopolitical earthquakes of the last 100 years, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And out of that collapse, a newly independent Ukraine is born.
Okay, so what happened right after that is absolutely crucial. The newly independent Ukraine made a monumental decision. As part of something called the Budapest Memorandum, it agreed to give up its nuclear weapons. And we're not talking about a few bombs here. This was the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. And in return, it got promises, security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK that its borders and its safety would be respected. Talk about a massive gamble. And that brings us to maybe the single most contentious issue of the whole post-Cold War era, NATO. You've got two completely opposite takes on this. From Moscow's point of view, NATO expanding eastward was a broken promise. It was a hostile encirclement. But if you ask the West, their view is, hey, this is just self-determination. These were free countries, former Soviet bloc nations, and they chose to join a defensive alliance for their own security.
So for a while there, through the 90s and the early 2000s, there was this really fragile balance. It kind of held. But as we get into the 21st century, that balance starts to just catastrophically unravel.
And 2014, that was the year it all just broke. It was the definitive breaking point. It all started with the Euromaidan protests in Kyiv against the pro-Russian president. Then, he flees the country. And Russia's response is immediate. They annex the Crimean Peninsula. And right after that, a war starts simmering in the eastern Donbass region. It was like one domino after another, just a rapid cascade of events that absolutely changed everything. Yeah, after 2014, there was really no going back. The two narratives we talked about, they became set in stone. They were completely irreconcilable. Moscow was utterly convinced it had just witnessed a Western-backed coup right on its doorstep. And for Kiev, what happened in 2014 was all the proof they needed that Moscow was an existential threat to their survival as a free country.
And that brings us pretty much to the present day. All of these threads we've been pulling on, that shared cradle, the diverging paths, the fall of the Soviet Empire, that lost balance, they all come together and culminate in what you could really call a war for history itself.
Then, in February 2022, that conflict that had been simmering for 8 years just exploded. Russia launched a full-scale invasion, taking that war in the Donbass and escalating it into the largest land war in Europe since World War II. I mean, it's just staggering to think about.
And this analogy, I think, really helps you understand the stakes from the Russian perspective. For them, the idea of losing Ukraine to the West, it isn't just a strategic loss on a chessboard. It feels like an unacceptable surrender of their own history, their identity, and that crucial security buffer on their border.
So when you look at the justifications for the war today, you can see how they're direct echoes of everything we've talked about. Russia frames this whole thing as a special military operation, right? One to defend its historical sphere of influence from an aggressive West. Meanwhile, the West frames it as a unified and necessary response to support a sovereign democracy. And they're backing that up with just massive amounts of military and financial aid.
So in the end, when you peel back all the layers, all the geopolitics, the military strategy, the economics, you get right back to a fundamental truth. This war is about so much more than just territory. It is a battle over who gets to write history, a struggle over narrative and identity, over who gets to define the past, and who, ultimately, controls the very heart of a civilization. It's a question whose answer is still being written, right now, on the battlefield.